Muslim women, particularly, those who wear hijab, we're a symbol for the religion, and that puts a target on our back. Before you even open your mouth, you walk into a room and people are making assumptions about you. People are, have their own preconceived notions, their biases, their stereotypes.
What turns a stereotype into a hate crime? It doesn't happen overnight. It starts with language, with repetition, with the normalization of suspicion. A Muslim woman walks into a newsroom and is treated as a curiosity. A hijab becomes a political statement. An algorithm amplifies fear because outrage performs better than nuance. And slowly, bias becomes infrastructure. Welcome to Injustice and Insight, a podcast by the Canadian Council of Muslim Women. I'm your host, Hannan Mohamud. As a lawyer, I've studied how the criminal code addresses hate, enhanced sentencing, aggravating factors, motive analysis, but by the time a case reaches a courtroom, we are already at the top of the pyramid. The real question is, what built the base? In 2017, 6 Muslim men were murdered at the Islamic Cultural Center of Quebec City. In 2021, a Muslim family was killed in a targeted attack in London, Ontario. These weren't random acts. They occurred in a climate where Muslims are consistently among the most negatively viewed religious groups in Canada, where media narratives, political rhetoric, and online ecosystems reinforce the idea that Muslim identity is incompatible with Western values. So today, we're examining that pipeline, from biased attitudes to discrimination to harassment to violence. Because hate crimes don't emerge from nowhere, they are cultivated.
Our office just released a new guide on combating and understanding Islamophobia for a more inclusive Canada. And in that guide, there is a whole section on intersecting identities where we talk about sort of the compounding ways that oppression can show up in our lives. And so whether, you're a Muslim, you're a woman, you're of a different ethnicity, really invite your listeners to have a look at, because it's meant to be a resource for all of us in our schools, in our workplaces, in our conversations. There is what's been called a pyramid of hate that was developed. And what it shows is, the base of that pyramid of hate is just simply the biased attitudes. The most people have some kind of bias. Like, bias is real, right? People are biased. All of us have biases. The only reason we can overcome them is just, again, through our exposure to one another, our exposure to diversity, our realization that you cannot scapegoat people. People are not all the same. Obviously, you learn that as you go through your life and you start to develop, your understanding and your nuance. But sadly, there are people who never get beyond scapegoating or stereotyping and making assumptions. Throw in then the online space now. So the flip side of great, we have so many more outlets, is that we also have so many more hateful outlets or far-right outlets or deliberate people on platforms who are pushing negative, hateful views of various groups, not only Muslims, other groups as well. And we stand in solidarity with anyone who's marginalized and stand up for the human rights of everyone. And so those voices find their audiences. And we know that algorithms on whether it's Facebook, whether it's other platforms, have been found to provide more and more visibility to content that angers, that makes people feel negatively. Again, it's not the feel-good stories that most people are going to share and share and share. It's going to be that Muslims are taking over. Muslims want to harm us. Muslims want to A, B, or C. Pick your poison, versus the reality of Muslims, like all other communities, are simply wanting to raise their families in the best way they can and help and work and be positive. I mean, it's just like any other regular human being. It's not rocket science. So the reality is that the media landscape is incredibly crucial in terms of shaping perceptions.
That person you hear explaining the structural side of this issue, that is Amira Elghawaby, Canada's former special representative on combating Islamophobia and a longtime advocate on this issue.
I would get those backhanded compliments. Wow, you're so articulate. You speak English so well, because they were expecting, me to maybe speak another language or be uneducated or to be, quiet, reserved. I'm a very outgoing, energetic, some people would say loud person. And sometimes people don't expect that. They're taken aback by that, And often I find myself actually trying to break the ice, trying to immediately kind of shatter that image and be the first to, make a joke or, kind of make people feel comfortable around me. And that also is exhausting, right? Constantly feeling like I am constantly having to combat this idea of what people have in their minds about what Muslim women can and should be.
What you just heard wasn't about a single incident, it was about constant exposure. The burden of being visible, the burden of being symbolic, the burden of representing an entire faith before you've even introduced yourself. You've just heard from Ginella Massa, a broadcasting journalist and media consultant, whose groundbreaking career in Canadian broadcasting has made her both a trailblazer and, at a time, a target.
Being that visible in a media space as being the first and for a long time the only hijab wearing television news anchor, not just in Canada but in all of North America. It's a heavy, heavy burden to carry. You're representing your community, you wanna do right by them, you wanna do it positively, and then you're also dealing with the public, just being in the public eye in general, being a woman in the public eye. You deal with, people's ideas about you, people's perceptions of you, people letting you know exactly what they think about not even just your work, but how you look, what you've chosen to wear. I'd gotten messages about my chipped nail polish from viewers before. So, like, that's just being a woman in media, period. And then add this layer of being this sort of groundbreaking, trailblazing, whatever you wanna call it. And so for me, I had to drown out a lot of that noise and really just kind of have blinders on and try to focus on the work, recognizing that a lot of times when people had something negative to say about me, it really was simply about my appearance, about how I had chosen to dress, how I had chosen to express myself, to express my religion, my faith, my relationship with God. And to put that kind of before everything else, and recognize that most people who had an opinion about that had actually never engaged with my work, had actually never watched a show that I was on or a report that I had done.
You've seen that the narrative of the Muslim as terrorist or the Muslim woman as oppressed, these types of stereotypes of who we are have been well documented, whether it's in Hollywood, and I think there was a quote in our guide where it's like 900 Hollywood films would demonstrate, Arabs and Muslims as the villain, as something to be frightened of, for instance. That has a significant impact on the public mind and the public perceptions. So the media plays an immensely important role. And as someone who worked in journalism, I worked at the CBC here in Ottawa for many years. I freelanced, I write. I'm very well aware that news in and of its nature is about bad news. You're not going to see, on the evening news, even in the traditional media, oftentimes, a story about, the local Muslim community raising lots of funds to help CHIO, the children's hospital, or organizing a food bank with other faith communities. You're just not going to see it because, it's that's not the nature of news in general. So what that means is if fellow Canadians don't have a lot of interaction with Muslims necessarily, and the only time they see Muslims reflected is through very negative news coverage because news is negative, that's going to shape their perceptions. And we look at polling in this country where poll after poll show that Muslims sadly are looked at negatively, that Islam is amongst the most negatively viewed, if not the negatively viewed major religion of any other religion in the country.
And most of the negative reaction that I had was simply about what I was wearing on my head. And so I had to come to a place where I said, this negative reaction says more about that person than about me. All I can control is, the work that I do, trying to do it at the best level that I can so that no one can ever say that I didn't deserve to be here, and really kind of just make the focus that. But, to say that it doesn't get to you or that it doesn't impact you would be a lie. But I really did try as much as possible as I could to sort of drown it out and focus on the work.
If personal bias is the spark, systems are the accelerant. Because stereotypes don't just live in private thought, they move through institutions, media, politics, law enforcement, digital platforms, and once embedded, they become harder to uproot. What's critical here is that violence sits at the top, not the bottom. The law can prosecute the top, but society constructs the base.
And, that's part of why my role as a, first hijab wearing television news anchor in Canada, I was dispelling that notion, not just by, I wasn't talking about Islam, I wasn't preaching about my religion. I was just existing in a space in a way that hadn't been seen before. I just happened to be, I was telling the nightly news. I was talking to people about the stories that they cared about. I just happened to be wearing hijab while I was doing it. And so it was this kind of, breaking this barrier, breaking this idea of what a Muslim woman can and should be. And I'd seen firsthand what some of those thoughts were, right? That I'm a symbol of oppression, that I'm a symbol of a backwards religion, that Canadian values are in combat with, Muslim values, that they can't be, one and the same, or you can't have those two things in the same sentence. And so I was constantly having to combat that notion that I would see was very alive, was very present for some people. Sometimes those were conversations I'd be having in my own newsrooms with people that I worked with, the questions that they would have about Islam. And, I was shocked.
The effects of institutional suspicion aren't just when loyalty becomes a question mark and identity becomes politicized. It's when Muslims feel that belonging becomes conditional.
What is unique for our communities is that there's an Islamophobia industry. And that Islamophobia industry means that there's millions of dollars being pumped into very hateful, dangerous narratives about who our communities are. Those narratives wind their way around the world. They're shared around our country. They are, metastasizing. They are changing. They are angering people.
Outrage is something profitable. Platforms reward what angers. Anger spreads faster than empathy. So the most distorted narratives travel the furthest and reach the most vulnerable audiences. That's not accidental. That's by design.
Just the other day, this woman called me on my work phone and started yelling at me and saying all sorts of horrible things to me because it's a publicly available phone number. And I just listened. I just listened to her, and I just felt so sad because I could tell that her media content that she is consuming is extremely, extremely one-sided. It is not based on information that's factual. It is based on fear and fear-mongering. And that's not happening by accident out there. There are deliberate actors who are making sure that our communities are viewed through a lens of suspicion, hostility, and hatred.
You've been hearing from Amira Elghawaby, Canada's special representative on combating Islamophobia. At the time of this recording, it is now former special representative on combating Islamophobia. She outlines how bias escalates when it's left unchecked.
The reality is, our communities are not asking for anything special. We're actually simply asking for being treated with the same dignity and rights that any other community should be treated in this country. And those are principles that are based on our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, on provincial human rights codes. We are a democracy. We're very blessed to live in a country that has the rule of law, that has these principles. Yes, we have, as I mentioned from the outset, not always met those principles. We have not always done the right thing, and there are shameful parts of this country's history that continue to impact us today. Reconciliation being the number one top thing, in my view, to ensure that this house that's been built on a faulty foundation, that's rectified, that the oppression of Indigenous communities is rectified. And all of us as settlers here have a responsibility to stand up for the human rights of Indigenous communities. Because again, that whole point, if any community's human rights are being eroded or erased or violated, eventually it's going to come to you, and or already has, essentially, because it cannot be strong enough if anyone is not fully benefiting from that promise of the rights and freedoms that we believe that we deserve in this country. There's been a journey for our communities in this country in so many different ways. And for me, I'm here in Ottawa on unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory, where I'm very, very blessed to live, to work, to raise a family. And I often share that I grew up with a lot of privilege. I grew up, in the 1980s, where, being Muslim, being Egyptian, born, growing up as a Canadian young girl, like I grew up really, as I often say, drinking the Kool-Aid. really believing that Canada is a place that celebrates multiculturalism, that, is a place where you can be who you wanna be, you can show up in spaces the way that you need to show up, the way that is authentic to you, and you could continue to be who you wanna be. And so I grew up with that ethos. I'm very grateful that I grew up that way. And I think because of that upbringing and that opportunity I had, when I started to realize that, wait a minute, time to take off the rose-tinted glasses and actually look around and understand that i- there's a lot of work that Canada and all of us need to do to ensure that everyone's human rights and everyone's dignity and everyone's equality is respected, and that there is, number one, an incredibly heartbreaking history of colonization, of oppression in this country for communities that are First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and that's a history that we were not taught in school. We did not know. I didn't know about anti-Black racism. I did not know about that. I did not know about a lot of forms of discrimination and oppression until I got to university. And until really in my personal life, I started to wear the hijab, which was in third year university while I was studying journalism at Carleton. And it was right before 9/11. And for those, listeners to the podcast who may not have been around, you're young. I assume it's a young audience, but some of you might be older and will remember. But those who don't know, 9/11 wasn't the beginning of Islamophobia in the West. Far from it. In fact, there had been books written about, Islamophobia in the West, and there's a long, sad pedigree to that. It was nevertheless a watershed moment in the sense that it really brought forward so much of the bias and discrimination against our communities. And I just started wearing the hijab, thinking that, I hey, I drank that Kool-Aid. I was gonna be a journalist. I was gonna do all the things. No one was gonna get in my way. But my father was actually the one who kind of saw it coming, even before 9/11, and said to me, "Are you sure you want to do this?" He was worried that I would face barriers, and of course he was right. I did face barriers, and I faced what many of us face now that even over 20 years, 25 years since 9/11, where uh, our identities are questioned, our loyalty questioned to the West, to Canada, to democratic ideals, all these tropes and stereotypes about what Muslims believe and what they want and all this sort of thing is out there.
Journalism shapes perception. If newsrooms don't reflect the communities they report on, coverage becomes skewed, even unintentionally. Representation isn't cosmetic, it's structural.
I remember going into my first internship in the largest local newsroom in the country thinking, these are educated and cultured people who are well-read and intellectuals. And the questions that they would ask me, I was like 22, fresh out of, journalism school, and it was shocking to me. Ignorance, the level of ignorance, the lack of knowledge, the lack of awareness in such a diverse city, in the city of Toronto, it was really, really jarring to me. The lack of understanding and awareness about Islam and the sort of bias and stereotypes that existed in those spaces. So, I worked with some folks who I was probably the first Muslim woman in hijab they'd ever maybe had a conversation with, or that they had a sort of, a working relationship with. And that was obvious. And so, for them, they saw Muslims as these foreign, mysterious other. And suddenly there was one in front of them that was like incongruent with their ideas of what Muslim women were like. So that was one of the things that I saw contributing to the way Muslim communities and their stories were reported on. I came into journalism. I started my internship at CTV Toronto, and at the time, there were actually a lot of stories in the news happening about the place of Islam in society, the place of religion in secular society. There was, a story about a school that was allowing Muslim students to pray at lunchtime, and it was sparking outrage and protests. And when really they were just trying to keep kids from going to Jummah on Fridays and not coming back after school. They were like, okay, you could just pray in the cafeteria and then go to class. And it was also around the time that the religious symbols ban, like the first time around that they were trying to bring it in. And so there were all these stories happening about Muslims, about the place of religion in secular society. We were tasked with reporting on it, and I would get asked, can you explain this to, like, why is this a big deal? Is your community talking about this? Like, why, can you help us understand? They just didn't know, and they didn't have those networks or those relationships where they could have those conversations and ask. And there was also a lot of reluctance from the Muslim community to engage with them. There was a lot of skepticism, there was a lot of fear, there was a lot of intimidation about, these media outlets they have their own agenda, they're racist, they're not interested in talking with us in good faith. Like, we just don't even want to engage with them. So it was a two-way street as well, right? Like, this kind of their preconceived notions about Muslims coloring the way that they would report on them, and then a lack of engagement and a lack of trust with these communities in terms of actually hearing from them and having them be a part of the conversation. And so, this is in news, but we also see even in pop culture the stories that we see about Muslims, right? Especially Muslim women, right? They're always oppressed, or they're having to be liberated or freed, or there's some scene where they're being deveiled. They're mysterious, they're exotic. So we absolutely see the way that media contributes to this. We've seen how that can have deadly impacts, particularly in Canada. And I'm sure you're going to be talking about the serious nature, the serious consequences that these misconceptions, these stereotypes can lead to real hate and can be fatal and can be deadly for Muslim communities.
Communities had been warned about rising hate long before all of the tragedies mentioned in today's episode. What makes these attacks particularly devastating is that they were predictable, in the sense that they followed years of escalating rhetoric. The warning signs were there.
And as you remember the tragic attack on our London family in 2021 actually led to so much heartbreak and shock, particularly that it wasn't the first massacre in this country of Muslims. We had the massacre in Quebec City in 2017.
Emergency responders pull the wounded from their place of worship as others rush in to help. An evening prayer service at the Quebec Islamic Cultural Center turned to chaos at the hands of two men now being called terrorists. Quebec police say the gunmen sprayed bullets through the men's section of the well-known mosque. More than 50 people were inside praying at the time.
We had been warning officials. We had been telling fellow Canadians, we're in a crisis. We are seeing a rise in hate against our communities.
This is not the first time believers at this mosque have been the victims of bias. During Ramadan, the holiest time of the year for Muslims, a severed pig head was left on the doorstep along with a threatening note.
And that massacre happened. We lost 6 beautiful members of the Quebec Muslim community, fathers, husbands, very positive. And whether or not they're positively contributing or not, they're human beings, and they should never have been killed at all, and yet taken from their families just after evening prayers on January 7, 2017. And in that massacre, we remember that there had been such a rise in Islamophobia in this country.
That's a sobering finding from a new Stats Can report. It found that police reported hate crimes rose by 5% in 2015 to 1,362. The jump was largely attributed to a 48% increase in incidents motivated by hatred of race or ethnicity. Those directed at Canada's Muslim populations rose by 61% from the previous year.
I, at the time, worked at the National Council of Canadian Muslims.
What was your first reaction when you saw this report from Stats Can?
Well, unfortunately, it wasn't too surprising, Marcia. 2015 was a difficult year for Canadian Muslims. We actually had a federal election campaign where Muslims were discussed in a very negative way. If we recall, there was the debate around a woman who wanted to wear the face veil at a citizenship oath. That became sort of the central election issue for the former Prime Minister, Mr. Harper. We also saw a discussion around barbaric cultural practices. We saw issues around unfortunate terrorist attacks overseas in Paris twice. And so unfortunately, whenever we see all of these types of factors at play, what happens is that on our streets, on our buses, in our public transit, in our schools, in our work settings, that there is unfortunately a bit of negativity that will come up. And the worst case scenario is when you actually see hate crimes perpetrated against vulnerable communities.
Then you had a killing actually of a volunteer in Toronto at a mosque in 2020, Mohamud Zafis.
Toronto's Muslim community is mourning the loss of 58-year-old Zafis, stabbed in the neck while he sat defenseless outside his community mosque after evening prayers. He was a volunteer caretaker and helping to enforce social distancing.
And then you had our London family.
Flowers and skid marks stain the site of a deadly attack. Here is where police say a man motivated by hate ran down a Muslim family just out for a walk. But a 74-year-old woman died here. A man and woman in their 40s and a 15-year-old girl were rushed to hospital and died. The lone survivor in hospital with serious injuries tonight, a 9-year-old. Police say a man driving a pickup truck purposely jumped the curb and mowed the family down.
We believe that this was an intentional act and that the victims of this horrific incident were targeted. We believe the victims were targeted because of their Islamic faith.
We are literally losing loved ones to this deadly type of hate. In fact, Canada holding a distinction of having had the highest number of deadly attacks against Muslims of any other G7 country. We have hate crimes in this country where, hate crimes legislation, we have a criminal code where if you are impacted by an assault or threat or whatnot, and there's a hate motivation, that's going to add, for example, in the sentencing of whatever consequence to the perpetrator if they're caught. The reality is what we hear from victims of hate crimes is that they're not always taken seriously when they go to police services. They're not always provided the support they need. The perpetrators are not always caught. And so there's so much that needs to be addressed in terms of ensuring the safety of our communities. So almost within a few months of taking office, I actually held the Canadian launch of a guide that was created internationally on how to support Muslim communities when it comes to hate crimes and hate incidents, that was targeting law enforcement to help law enforcement do better. And I'm pleased that we've had a lot of interest from law enforcement agencies. I've met with police chiefs who, are interested in these issues. But at the end of the day, and perhaps if there's sort of one kind of main message I hope your listeners take away today on this program, is that our institutions require that we fully participate in them in order to ensure that they do live up to their promise. Because almost any institution, whether it's schools, whether it's workplaces, whether it's our governments, they all have commitments on ensuring human rights are upheld, ensuring diversity is respected. There's their commitment. You can find them in most places. The question is, how well are they being acted upon? And so each of us, in a way, is a representative in our own spaces. You have a responsibility, and I don't want to make it sound like homework, but you have an opportunity, let me say, to help those that you work with or you go to school with to fulfill the promise that they have towards you as a member of their community. And so where that's not being met, there are ways to rectify that, whether it's through human rights complaints, whether it's through grievances, whether it's through various other processes to help people come to the right place to ensure that if you have been a victim of a hate crime or if you've been a victim of discrimination, one of the most powerful ways to heal from that is to make sure it never happens to anyone else again. And so that is very empowering. And that's where we can be the superheroes in our own stories and make sure. And when you don't feel strong enough, there's so many organizations that are there to support you. We're we're fortunate. We have the National Council of Canadian Muslims. We have the Canadian Muslim Public Affairs Council. We have the Muslim Legal Support Center. We have an ASIHA helpline. We have Canadian Council of Muslim Women. The list goes on and on. I don't want to forget anyone. We have the Muslim Advisory Council of Canada. There's so many organizations that have, and over the past 20 years, this has been an incredible growth for our community. We can be proud of that. Our civil society is getting stronger and strengthening. People are engaging and thousands of emails are being sent every day to members of parliament on the issues they care about. We should be proud of where we are going as a community, as communities, diverse communities. And the main point is that we have to be engaged. It is not optional. You got to engage in some way. The level of engagement might differ from person to person. You may not want to be out there in the media talking necessarily like anyone else, but maybe you engage in a different way. Maybe you engage by simply sending an email to say to your colleagues, hey, I'd love to invite you out for an iftar next Ramadan. Join me for iftar. Come to my home, or let's do something together. It's just a little bit of it. That's engagement. Engagement doesn't have to be, everything all at once everywhere. No, engagement is little ways of demonstrating that you're there, you're present, and you're proud of who you are.
I mean, when I first started, before my show even aired, there were 3 articles written in French media about me, about why the public broadcasters should not have a woman in hijab anchoring a national newscast. Like, and this is what I mean about having these opinions about women, Muslim women, or me or my place before I've even had a chance to utter one word on television or do one interview. And it was like, watch my show first and then decide if I should be here or if this is, a hindrance to me being a good journalist. Has it gotten better? I would say no. I've been in journalism for 15 years. In some ways, it sometimes feels like we're going backwards. For so long, I was the first. For a long time, I was the only. I could name the number of hijab-wearing journalists on my hand, and I don't think anyone has anchored a national newscast again since I left CBC. So it's disheartening, and for me, when I left, that was a difficult decision, a big and difficult decision, but one of the things that I said was, I don't wanna be the first and the last. I wanna help other women, navigate this space and not just survive in it, but thrive in it. And so I'm hopeful for that future, but it's felt like chipping away at an iceberg with a toothpick.
Freedom of expression is foundational in a democracy, but when certain communities experience disproportionate scrutiny for exercising that freedom, it raises a difficult question. Is equality being applied consistently? Because selective protection of rights erodes trust in institutions.
So in terms of freedom of expression is part of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We live in a democracy. We have the right to speak. We have the right to express ourselves. We have the right to practice our faith. We have a right to be treated with dignity, with equality. These are all rights that as a country we have signed up for essentially as Canadians. I think the balance really is that, as was talked about in the report that was just released, and again, I invite your listeners to take a look. It's available at the Islamophobia Research Hub. The report is called The Palestine Exception. In that report, you can see how the principles of freedom of expression have certainly been curtailed, if not fully violated, over the past almost 2 years, in the sense of, our communities talking about the pain and trauma of whether they have loved ones in Gaza who are experiencing what as I said, experts call a genocide, or whether they have been Palestinian and have been wanting to talk about these issues for a long time and never, ever given the space to do so. And so all of it is interconnected. Essentially, it's second-class citizenship means that you're not fully being treated as a citizen of this country. You're not fully able to exercise the same rights and freedoms as others. What we're trying to do, I think, as Canadian Muslims is just ensure that our human rights are respected like anyone else. And I think that when we have these conversations, it means that we are engaged. We're not giving up. We're not giving up on our rights and freedoms. We're ensuring that we're part of the conversation, even though there's so much hate, even though there's so much marginalization and isolation in places that we shouldn't be isolated, in places like our schools and our workplaces and in our society. This requires determination. It requires leaning on one another, and it requires being together as strong communities. And so, just having these types of conversations, just raising your own awareness is so valuable and part of the way we're going to get through this.
Hi, yes. I was trying to call. I have a 2-month-old baby, and I ran out of formula last night, and I was wanting to see if there's any way you all can help with a can of baby formula.
We can, ma'am. Where do you live? Do you live in Charlotte? This is the kind of publicity or PR, you could say, that you can't buy because this was organic.
Nearly a week ago, Nicolene Monroe called the masjid as part of a social experiment to see if churches across the country would help in a time of need. So far, more than 30 said no, and at least 9 said yes. The video of the experiment has gone viral on TikTok and other social media platforms.
Talking about that woman who calls the mosque and is able to get baby formula after calling 30 churches and almost all of them saying no. The power of media, right? Whether it's social media or traditional media, the power of that, being able to share that experience with such a wide audience. She was able to undo how many decades of misconceptions about Muslims with just a simple video and TikTok is so incredible. And it's true, I have a social media presence, and I also was a national news anchor. And, I'd run into people on the streets in the grocery store, and it was like 50-50 between people who would say, "Hey, I love watching you on TV," and, "Hey, I love watching you on TikTok." And so to me, it's not an either or, because I still do think there is a value in traditional media, and in journalism as a professional industry that has checks and balances when it comes to sharing information, but they've lost a lot of trust. And so there is opportunity in social media to tell our own stories. I mean, when we look at what's happened in Gaza, when we look at, people being able to access information, people being able to tell their own stories, and even it has also been a vehicle, to spread dawah. Like, people have been exposed to Islam, have been exposed to the faith of Palestinians who are calling onto their God in a moment of such, in the face of such horrible events, and has made people question, what is this religion? That people who are facing the most horrible things are still holding on to the rope of Allah, right? And so it's so interesting to see the opportunities to tell our own stories, and to be our own narrators, and not have these gatekeepers anymore. And I think there's room for both of them.
And so each of us have a role in that, in the sense of, at the very, very least, most of us have a social media platform, whether we're on Insta, whether we're on TikTok, wherever we are, that we can share the positive stories that are out there, that we can amplify. We can be our own editors in a way and help put those out. And we can support, we can donate to various independent media to ensure that we've got alternative voices out there. There's all sorts of ways we can subscribe to independent media, or media that we feel is reflecting, a fuller story about life in general, not just our communities.
Newsrooms absolutely have a responsibility. I mean, to me, I see journalism as a public good, even though most of them are owned by private, telecoms companies that are just seeing a line item that's losing them money and isn't making as much money as the iPhone that they're selling. And so they're not investing in it. But I do see news and journalism as a public good, and as such it should reflect the audiences that they are reporting on. So I talk about Toronto being the most diverse city in the world, and Toronto newscast should look like the most diverse city in the world. A Canadian newscast should look like Canada. They should be telling the stories of Canada, of all Canadians, and that includes, not just Muslim communities, but all marginalized immigrant communities, communities of color, etc. And so number one is making sure those communities are represented in the newsrooms, because I'm sure me being in the newsroom impacted the kinds of stories we told, and the ways that we told them, and the voices that we included, because of the networks we were able to tap into and the trust we were able to create to create space for people to feel like they could engage with us as a newsroom. And that goes the same for all these other communities that are often left out and whose voices are silenced in the mainstream. So, number one is that representation, but meaningful representation, not just window dressing, not just, parading around your journalists of color to be in the commercial for the 6 o'clock newscast, but to actually hear their stories and hear their ideas, and hear their criticisms and their suggestions about how we could approach stories differently. So that's the first step, and it seems like we're still stumbling on that first step, because so much of this idea of diversifying newsrooms is about ticking a box, as opposed to actually, having meaningful representation.
And so the federal government in 2021 had an Islamophobia summit. Community members and organizations contributed recommendations. There were over 100 recommendations made. Among the recommendations were to create this office to combat Islamophobia, an office that would provide advice to the federal government, raise awareness about these issues, and really help bring forward community-informed solutions to how we address these really deeply dangerous trends in our society that don't just hurt Canadian Muslims. They hurt all Canadians. They hurt everyone, because we will see that wherever there are opportunities to harm and to violate people's human rights, that means that you've got the potential for the rights of others as well. And so even if we're taking it from a purely selfish perspective, we need to stand up for each other, because it's only a matter of time where someone else's rights they're going to come for you. So you've got to stand up. You've got to stand. If you want to have human rights, you've got to stand up either for yourself or for others to make sure that they're guaranteed. Our communities are part of Canada's fabric. We contribute in so many positive ways. We are here. We are proud of who we are. And those who are trying to frighten us and to silence us, they're not going to win. They're not going to win. And we are going to persevere. I know personally, I've been in those situations where people have tried to be hateful towards me. And there is certainly an instinct. But when you see someone else stand up proudly and say, no, this is our right to be here. This is our right to be who we are. And we're not going to let anyone take that away from us. That inspires others.
I would just say, keep fighting. I feel like, especially in journalism, people feel really disheartened. People feel really kind of, in some ways, demoralized. I think after George Floyd, there was this idea that maybe we might be moving in the right direction. There's this whole conversation about Black Lives Matter and that it was not a controversial statement, that journalists should be allowed to say that. It was not political or controversial to say that Black Lives Matter and that we should be able to march in the streets in protest. And that is not, against our journalistic pillars of not being political or not, sharing our opinion on controversial topics. And, there was hope that that could be extended. And then we saw, with what's happening in Gaza, that suddenly we forgot all the things that we listened and learned about, and we shut the door on a lot of these voices. But at the same time, in the last 2 years, I have seen a shift in stories that 2 years ago would not have been covered, would not have been touched, would not have been talked about. We have seen a shift. And so as much as I say it feels like chipping away at an iceberg with a toothpick, we are still making change, even if it is incremental. In our own way, we need to continue to take up space. We need to continue to fight the good fight in whatever avenues, as we've said, because of the real and deadly impact of not doing so. And so, we have to continue to fight to be heard, to make our voices heard, and to take up space in whatever ways that we can. And that might be in mainstream media, that might be in social media, that might be in some other avenue, but, every little bit counts.
Hate crimes are the most visible expression of something that begins much earlier, in a classroom, in a newsroom, on a timeline, in a policy debate. Interrupting violence means interrupting the narrative long before it escalates. It means challenging bias when it's still socially acceptable. It means demanding institutions live up to their stated commitments. And it means refusing to normalize language that dehumanizes. Because words shape perception, perception shapes policy, and policy, or its failure, shapes lives.